You're listening to Decolonisation, a podcast series that explores how Ukraine and Eastern Europe are perceived globally and why countering Russian imperial influence is crucial for the future of global democracy. The podcast is created by Ukrainian International, and I'm your host, Anastasiia Marushevska. And today we have Catherine Fieschi as our guest. She's a leading political expert and global analyst, and her work is focused on the impact of populism and authoritarianism on advanced democracies and markets. She's also a founding director of international advisory and research company Counterpoint. And Catherine's work have been credited with creating a concept of new vision of populism as an ideology. And today we will speak a lot about this. Catherine, thank you again for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You've been researching populism, I would say, since before it became a mainstream topic. Could you tell what drew your attention to populism? I believe it was beginning of the 90s.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, I've been researching and working on populism for far too long before it was mainstream. But it's true that when I was a PhD student, a very long time ago now, I had this inkling that there were some deep transformations ahead that were going to occur, particularly in some of the advanced democracies. By the early 1990s and certainly the mid-1990s, you already had developments in France around populism. In fact, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father, who founded what was then called the Front National, founded it in 1972. And by 1984, they were already running in European elections, running in local elections. So the transformation had begun. And the reason it seemed so interesting is that it looked like people who had been in the past on the extreme right, but who were realizing that in order to bring ideas of nationalism, anti-immigration, anti-representative democracy, that they would have to use new tools and new forms of rhetoric and new forms of political campaigning. And this is where I think we see, certainly in Europe, because there's a long tradition of this a different tradition in Latin America and South America. But certainly in Europe, I think we see it emerging as early as the 1980s. This realization that to make these nationalist, sovereignist points, you are going to have to use a different kind of tool and maybe different ideas to get people back interested into them. And I think that's when populism became more popular, as it were, and began to become more popular in Western Europe.
I think that it's in many ways connected to the persona, I would say, of Jean-Marie Le Pen. And in your book, Populocracy, you actually tell the story about your PhD research, which was focused mainly on Front National and particularly on Jean-Marie Le Pen. I found your description in the book of his character especially interesting because I believe that populism often relies on personality and emotional appeal rather than just rational decision-making. But maybe can you tell a little bit why you decided to focus on Jean-Marie Le Pen and why he's significant in understanding modern populism?
Yes, absolutely. So I think what it is that I decided to focus on France and on Jean-Marie Le Pen because it was an interesting case study, like so many of the, or some anyway, of the Western European countries, where people thought that given the experiences of the Second World War, that we weren't going to see nationalism or far-right rhetoric, or blatantly anti-Semitic discourse anymore, right? And yet somehow Jean-Marie Le Pen was one of the first ones in Western Europe, if not the first one, in fact, to actually put these ideas, back in the mix, when in fact they had been considered to have become taboo. And one of the ways in which he did this, this was what was very striking in my conversations and my long interviews. This was a long time ago now, right? With him, was the fact that he had a conception of politics that was very far removed from what Western democracies had evolved into. He rejected any kind of technocracy. He wasn't interested in the kind of rational aspects of policy. What he was interested in is all these emotions, which he felt were being bottled up. He was interested in, the different strands, including the very dark strands of political culture in France. He was interested in breaking the hold. And this is what I think is, a little bit groundbreaking in what Jean-Marie Le Pen did. And then we saw it happen in so many places, including across Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and the United States. It was breaking the consensus around the post-war settlement. That was a technocratic settlement. That was a Western settlement around Western values and multilateralism. He really, not only did he not like all this, but he was very disdainful of them. He really was very dismissive of all of these concepts. And that was what was very striking, that, at a time when nobody thought that you could get away with talking about anti-Semitism in the way that he did because he tapped into this idea that there were still people, and there would be potentially more and more people in French and European populations and democratic populations who would want to go against this consensus, partly because they just rejected, what was called, at the time, the Pax Americana, if you like. It's very striking when you hear Jean-Marie Le Pen talk, right? His biggest enemy wasn't Russia. His biggest enemy was the U.S., right? And it was the consensus politics imposed, what he thought imposed by the U.S. and the post-war settlement. So, I think that opened up, reopened this whole area of thinking, this whole area of contestation. And as we can see, it has built up massively until today, where, one of the characteristics of populism, as you have pointed out, in the past, is really the rejection of what is seen as a Western-led, American-led defense of Ukraine.
It's actually the question in regards to Russia, because you already mentioned it. Both Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen have expressed support for Vladimir Putin, even though now they're not really working together, but they're both aligned on this kind of view of Russia as not necessarily as an enemy. And they're both, for example, supported the illegal occupation of Crimea in 2014. As far as I know, Marine Le Pen called it as reunification or something like this. So what kind of Russian narratives do they use? And why are those narratives appealing to their audience?
Right. So, it's a really good question. Because there's different layers to this. There's first of all, there is a rejection of the US and of a European Union that they think is too slavish in its alliance with the United States. So, that in a sense, regardless of whether we're talking about Russia or we're talking about anyone else, the fact is that, anybody who is an enemy of the U.S. is a friend of theirs, right? That's one aspect of it. But I think also the other thing that's very important here is that there is an anti-NATO, specifically an anti-NATO discourse. So, the Russian narrative that they've used is that essentially, NATO, just came too close to, the living space, of Russia, and in a sense, went back on its word, by supporting Ukraine. And therefore, one of the strands of the rhetoric is very much that Russian rhetoric, which is, NATO broke its word. It got too close. It's been involved in a land grab, and therefore, that rejection, of Ukrainian sovereignty, because it was seen or has been depicted by them as a NATO move. And of course, it is NATO as an alliance, but it is also the symbol of another set of values and concepts that they reject, and that is the very idea of multilateralism, right? They reject it, and NATO is symbolic of that multilateralism, and they reject this very idea because it, in a sense, inviting people into this alliance, they feel that it negates one of their key concepts, which is the concept of national sovereignty. And of course, their stance of sovereignty is very paradoxical, right? Because on the one hand, when they sit in the European Parliament, all of these parties, not just Marine Le Pen's party, but all of these populist parties on the right are constantly going on and on about not wanting any kind of interference from the European Union into their national affairs in the name of national sovereignty, of course. But when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then, they slide to a different interpretation of sovereignty, which is that it is Russia's sovereignty that's been called into question by NATO. So, of course, these things these concepts are being used elastically because this is what populist parties do, not just on the right, also on the left. But in this case, right, there's very much this sense that sovereignty is a concept that you can, as the French would say, you can put it in any sauce you'd like, in order to make it work for you. And if you need to use it to make it work in favor of Russia, that's just invaded a territory, be it Crimea or be it Ukraine, or whether you need to use it for yourself when you want to keep the European Union out of national affairs, then, they basically have a kind of variable geometry version of sovereignty. But I think that, these are the key elements of the discourse that they've been using, which, has very strong echoes of the Russian discourse with respect to multilateral institutions, and with respect to sovereignty and to the role of NATO.
And this raises a question of how dangerous populism is, and for how long it has been disregarded as, I would say, a mere political approach, rather than an ideology. And in your book and in general, you were talking a lot about populism as ideology. Can you explain a little bit, how do you define when populism becomes ideology, and how do you explain it specifically in your book as well, Populocracy?
Of course. So I think that, because populism was often considered to be, either about a charismatic leader, This was very, very much rooted in the early approaches to the study of populism, particularly those rooted in Latin America with Perón and Eva Perón. That kind of set a little bit of a mold where, populism was about a charismatic leader claiming to be of the people. And then a lot of that also turned into looking at populism often as what people call a communication style, appealing to emotions, demagoguery, a particular kind of rhetoric. And nobody really wanted, and I still think, there's not very many of us who defend this idea that populism is an ideology. But I think that one of the reasons why no one wanted to understand populism as an ideology is because you can find populism on the left side of the spectrum and you can find populism on the right side of the spectrum. France is super interesting at the moment on this, right? Because you definitely have a populist party on the right in the form of Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, but you also have a populist party on the left in the form of La France Insoumise, with Mélenchon. Yeah. And so because you could see it on the left and on the right, there was something, I think, for most people that was counterintuitive, right? An ideology has to be on one side or another side. And if you were on both sides, then that made it a little less of an ideology. But I think that the criteria in terms of what makes something an ideology is whether or not it has an it's a set of ideas that have an objective and a plan of action, right? This is not just a set of ideas. It's not just a kind of communication. There is a plan of action at the heart of populism, both on the left and on the right. And that is that what they're really, what these parties really want is to eliminate, the kind of the mediation of representative institutions between the people and their leaders. What they want is a form of very direct democracy, right? So that's why they're so keen on referendums. They're very keen on these kinds of aspects of direct democracy without mediation through representatives. And that's, and therefore, in their arguments, this is how you capture the will of the real people, the will of the real majority. And I think that, this to me is a little bit more than just a communication style. There is an objective here to really go for a form of democracy that is strictly majoritarian democracy. It is just purely the will of the majority. And that's very dangerous, it seems to me, in our contemporary diverse societies, where you also have strong minorities, right, that need to be protected, even if they are exactly, so they need to be represented, they need to be protected. And what you have in populism is this idea that, what you want to do is just impose the will of the majority, even if it's only 51%, right, or 52%. The Brexit referendum was a very, very good illustration of this. 48% of the people were against this, but nevertheless, there was no negotiation really, the will of the 52 carried it forward. And that, that is problematic in what are complex societies where people hold very different ideas and potentially some different preferences, from one another. But this is why I think it's worth looking at populism as more than a communication style, more than just a leadership style, but actually a kind of politics, that is particularly at odds with actually what our democracies need right now, which is better forms, more subtle forms, more sophisticated forms of representation, as opposed to going back to, very blunt instruments like, basic majoritarian democracy. And for me, that feels like a very ideological proposition rather than just playing around with communications.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You already mentioned Jean-Luc Mélenchon, from La France Insoumise, and he's a far left in France. And we can hear a lot of discussion, I would say, at least in Ukraine. I think mostly people know about Jean-Marie Le Pen. And they know about the threat somehow that populists in Europe are posing. But at the same time, we usually discuss the far right. We do not talk about far left that much, which I believe to be problematic. And in your book, Populocracy, for example, you explained that Jean-Luc Mélenchon is a populist, but at the same time, Jeremy Corbyn, the former member of Labour Party in the UK, not populist. Can you explain this distinction and can you elaborate on how you do it within the left political spectrum?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that, one of the things about populism is that, as you might have noticed, it's a word that is used in all sorts of ways, including when people just want to say that something is popular, right? But something can be obviously popular without being populist. But I think, one of the things that we see on the left and what we see in particularly in Jean-Luc Mélenchon is, very much the same idea that there is in his case it's particularly interesting because really even in the last election where they did relatively well, they only have 72 seats out of 577, right, in the French National Assembly. So it's far from being a majority, in the French Parliament. Yeah. But nevertheless, what's interesting about him is that he has the same idea that actually that government in France has been confiscated by corrupt elites, right? So Marine Le Pen definitely thinks this, and he thinks that too. The difference between them is that, they are, there is no real anti-immigration stance in Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and what's absent often in left-wing populism is certainly in Western Europe is there's very little nationalism involved. In fact, if anything, there's an internationalism involved. So it makes it a particular kind of populism. But on the other hand, what you see is the same arguments about the fact that mainstream parties are all the same, that mainstream parties don't have the interests of ordinary people at heart. And to some extent, you could argue that it's almost easier for a party of the left to make a populist claim, right? Because we normally associate the defense of ordinary people with left-wing parties rather than with right-wing parties. But they have that populist twist in the case of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, in that they really are very much, not just anti-capitalist elite, which is what you would expect from the left, but they're against all elites, right? So it's bankers and journalists and every other political party, ditto for international organizations. So they really are, they really do fit that mold. And I think that in terms of the difference between Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, I don't want to overstate the difference, right? Because there are similarities. There are similarities there. But I think that one of the differences, in terms of Jeremy Corbyn is that Jeremy Corbyn, wanted to capture power through the Labour Party. He might have wanted, some institutional arrangements or amendments in terms of proportional representation, for example, or things of the sort. But he wasn't calling for a wholesale change in regime. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is far more revolutionary than that, right? He's calling for a sixth republic with very different rules. He's far more of a disruptor, but the reason I made the comparison is because the comparison was worth making. They are reminiscent of one another, but I don't think that the objectives were the same. I think Mélenchon's objectives are far more revolutionary than those of Jeremy Corbyn were.
It's actually you talked a lot about this. I guess one of the famous approaches of what populists are using, this kind of against the elite. Yeah, and you can hear it a lot. And I think this unites different political parties, not just populists, but this is something that this fight against the elite of majority is quite famous. But there is another one that I would call it common sense, yes, so-called common sense, which populists often apply to every issue. Even the most complex one, like immigration or war, somehow, it's just common sense not to give weapons, if there is a war, because no weapons, no war. This kind of very simplified logic of things. And why do you believe this kind of simplified approach that populists use still have support in countries even with high level of political culture, of long history of democracy and choice somehow?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the claims that most populists make is that democracy has been confiscated by technocrats, right? This is really one of their major claims, that democracy has become, is now in the hands of people who are accountants, people who are basically, what they call bean counters, who are so busy working out, incredibly complex policies that they have forgotten the basics of democracy. That this is what, many populists and populist leaders would claim. In other words, that technocracy has replaced politics, and that some of this is actually a kind of a strategy on behalf of current elites to claim that everything is so complex that it's too difficult for ordinary people to understand, and therefore ordinary people should just trust them, right? Should just trust the technocrats to do the budgets, to elaborate the policies, to implement them, and so on and so forth. And so common sense becomes, the first thing to say about common sense is that it becomes a very powerful trope, because it is the very opposite of technocracy, right? Instead of being super rational, of weighing the pros and cons, of creating maybe scenarios in order to experiment what the pressures are in complex societies and in an interdependent world, common sense is the opposite of that. It's basically to do with your gut reaction, right? It's a kind of emotional reaction that tells you whether something is right or wrong without too much analysis, without weighing up the pros and cons. There's something very instinctive about common sense. And this is what, populists use this idea of common sense, as the very opposite of everything that they hate, and which they often refer to as being, a complex plot against ordinary people. And so they reach for this idea of common sense. And then there's another way in which common sense, I think, is also useful to populists. And that is that, for them, it's almost used as a litmus test to see and evaluate who is a member of the real people and who isn't, right? So there's this idea that actually, if you're one of us, as the populists would define it, if you're an ordinary French person, an ordinary Dutch person, an ordinary Hungarian, actually you carry this kind of political, cultural DNA within you. You don't need to work things through. You should know immediately what you think, right? And that is so. Being immediate in your reactions, whether it's approval or rejection, shows that you're actually, one of these authentic people that, that the populists are so desperate to reach and to construct, in a sense. So it plays these two roles, right? It plays a communications role in terms of rejection of technocracy. And then it also plays an ideological role because it enables them to say, well, if you're really one of us, you really don't need to think about this for very long, right? It should be instinctive. And it's a way of telling the real people, the authentic people, from everybody else who they will tend to reject.
But basically, they use this idea of common sense in general, this emotional appeal somehow, and it's not necessarily the topics that they use are actually supported by majority, that they make sound that they're supported.
Absolutely.
I think in your book you also talked about it, that not necessarily the topics picked up by populists are actually popular. Yeah, they just made them sound popular.
Exactly. And this is why, the common sense thing is useful because, once you've called something common sense, right, you can actually start to create your majority, right? You can get some people who might be hesitating to think, oh, I shouldn't be hesitating about this, right? This is common sense. I should land on this side of the argument. I shouldn't have to be thinking about it. So, the idea of common sense is powerful because it also allows you to create the illusion, right, of a majority, the illusion of a majority of ordinary people to support your views. It's very interesting that, for example, in France, there was a new law on immigration passed just before Christmas, in December 2023. And part of the initial law, the proposed law, was to do with regularizing immigrants who were sort of illegally in France, if they were in sectors of the economy that were short of labor, so whether it's construction or restaurants, et cetera. And it was very interesting to see, for example, that even in the Rassemblement National, a majority of people were in favor of this, right? Which is completely counterintuitive to what you would think a Rassemblement National voter would want. But in fact, for them on this one, the common sense was, if these people are useful, then, by all means, legalize them, and give them special status and let them stay in. And it was really revealing because the party hadn't counted on this. The party campaigned against this measure until it realized that actually for this time, the common sense was with the majority of their voters, and their voters weren't agreeing with them, right? So it was an instance where their view of common sense and actually their voters' view of common sense for once wasn't exactly the same.
Yeah, I guess probably pretty often not the same.
Exactly.
But it used nicely, against the voters.
Exactly.
Another one which I find fascinating is like kind of another rhetoric is something around colonialism and imperialism, and both far left and far right are using it, just kind of from different perspectives. Yes. But far left populists, I would say, they use this anti-European and anti-Western rhetoric, but they're also kind of disguise it as anti-colonialism. But at the same time, you can see support, for example, from the side of Mélenchon or Jeremy Corbyn. You can see support for regimes as Maduro in Venezuela or Assad or Putin, not necessarily straightforwardly, but still through some kind of remarks or the policies that they want to support. And there is this kind of feeling that far left populists, especially in Europe, have this kind of sympathy for communism and autocracy. And where it comes from? What's the reason for it? Is it lack of education? For example, we see in the society about the results of autocratic regime, for example, Soviet Union, or is it just a kind of a game of this common sense that they're trying to play as well here?
So I think that in terms of the kind of anti-Europeanism, anti-Westernism disguised as anti-colonialism, I think that you can see this at play both on the left and on the right, right? They may be admiring, different strongmen, but sometimes they're admiring the same strongmen, right? And one of the reasons for that, I think, in both cases, left and right, is this idea that, Europe and the West are trying to impose their values, on the rest of the world. This has definitely, been used certainly on the populist right in Europe, against Ukraine, basically arguing that, this is a definition of liberal democracy that is basically being driven by the United States, driven by Western values, and they put it on the same, and they basically reject that. On the left, what you have is a rejection of the Western values and the European values, because you can point to this idea that it was precisely these Western values that created colonialism. So the rejection of Western values now, and the rejection of the United States, the rejection of Europe, all of this is basically being marshaled to argue that siding with Ukraine, or not siding explicitly with Gaza, is in a sense is a reflection of the fact that what is at work here is not just Western values, but it's Western values as colonial values. And this is why I think it's so important for particularly, on the right of the populist, on the right of the political spectrum, to be able to say, look, the people who are defending Ukraine are really only a handful of countries in the world who are trying to maintain what is an old world order and to keep the emerging powers from actually having a say in the new settlement. And so, the fact that China is supporting Russia, the fact that many are sitting on the fence and abstaining in UN resolutions is being used by a lot of these populists, particularly on the right, but also on the left, to argue that this is, in fact, is the rest, as opposed to the West, finally taking a stance against what they're depicting as, the old colonial powers, even if, to some extent it's a bit of a stretch for the United States, but you can make a colonial argument about, First Nations, of course, in the United States. And all of this is to say that, of course, there are arguments to be made about reconsidering the role of emerging powers and the role of non-Western countries. But what populists are encouraging us to do is to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? To basically say everything associated with Western values, with multilateralism, with the European Union is basically poisoned or tinged, with colonialism and with colonial values, and therefore it should be rejected. And we saw this, really actually shape the discussion around the European elections. When Gaza and Ukraine became, in elections where normally very few people talk about foreign policy, both Gaza and Ukraine became topics of conversation because they polarized opinion around this idea of siding with the West and Ukraine was siding with the side of the old colonizers.
But this is, from the point of view of the Ukrainian, not just like someone who works, with international communications. It's fascinating for me how they managed to actually put this as anti-colonialism, because Russia is one of, along with China, its two biggest modern empires. And Ukraine is actually fighting imperialist war. And they still managed to sell this idea somehow that, not supporting Ukraine is actually being anti-empire, anti-colonialism. But how do they manage to sell this? What is the gaps, I would say, in communications maybe, or in education that actually allow them to build this narrative? Because if you look just a little bit into the history of Russia, you will learn that this is actually not true. Everything, this idea is false, that Russia or China will bring some kind of other system rather than the West is offering, because they're actually not offering anything, that can be at least nearly as, I would say, sustainable and actually democratic, because what they're offering is destruction.
And
so this is interesting how they actually managed to sell it, not just to create this idea, but to actually convince others.
Absolutely. And and I think that there's a couple of bits to the answer here. One is that, of course, one of the ways that they managed to sell this is one of the reasons, is one of the areas that I talk about a lot in the book. And that, of course, is the power of digital culture and the fact that, one of my hunches in 2000s, 2010s, as particularly as social media took off and transformed the political landscape, right? One of the obvious hunches there was that people were going to start to become more and more tribal. And, when you have that, you have more and more polarization. And when you have more and more polarization, you get into situations like you are in Germany and in France right now, right? Where you basically have governments that are hanging by a thread because the fragmentation and the polarization is such that it's very difficult for a coalition to hang together. And then when you do get a coalition, it's very difficult for a coalition to make any decisions because they're immediately vetoed by the rest of the country, or held hostage, like, for example, by the Sarah Wagenknecht party, who is threatening to basically not enter into coalition unless, Germany revises its support for Ukraine. So, what's interesting is how through the creation of these relatively small tribes, right? I mean, we're talking about people who have between 10 and 15% of the popular vote, right? But, they are largely able to hold governments hostage because there are no obvious majorities anymore. And, and my sense is that, it's quite clear that, digital culture, that social media has created this fragmentation and this polarization. It has hugely contributed to it. It hasn't invented it. There was polarization before social media. There was fragmentation before social media, but it wasn't as intense, and as advanced as it is now. And through through these sort of echo chambers, of course, you can circulate strengthen messages, create conspiracy theories. And this is how you end up, creating these beliefs and these nonsensical beliefs, even in populations that, that should know better and that are educated and that are well informed and then have some form of democratic culture, right? But there's enough frustration, I think, in the general public, enough people who are frustrated that they are willing to believe alternatives, even if these alternatives are unbelievable in some respects. So I think that, you would know even better than I do, that, part of the reason why these ideas get a foothold is that, they are propagated, they are manipulated, and they are weaponized. I think the other thing that's very interesting is, again, I go back to the case of France here. If I look at somebody like Jean-Luc Mélenchon and LFI, one of the reasons why we can explain how successful he's been in his use of the anti-colonial trope is the fact that he has single-mindedly pursued a very alienated and young Arab voters, whose frustration in France is quite legitimate, right? Whose alienation from the political process is also quite striking. And he has been very clever in making a pitch to them, particularly around, the issue of Gaza, but also via the issue of Gaza, doing that, playing that equivalency game, right? Again, using this idea of decolonizing powers, being, not coming to the defense of the right people. He has been very, very clever in mobilizing them, right? And I'm not saying that, that accounts for his entire, popularity, but it accounts for the fact that it has traction because they have latched onto it. And, and I can really understand why they have, right? I can really understand why their frustration with the political system and their level of representation right now would make them angry and frustrated. But I think that, recuperating the voice of deeply alienated minorities is also something that is contributing to some of these dynamics, certainly in the case of France.
Yeah, well, when I listen to this, it reminds me of Soviet Union, unfortunately, because this kind of far left, like extreme left, rhetoric, and also they used a lot this position that Soviet Union is anti-colonial and that they help colonies to fight against empires, which was, of course, untrue because they just used it for their personal gains.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, I heard this idea from the left academia, even now, that Soviet Union actually was anti-colonial, which is just ridiculous, because actually, if you look into this idea, they also used this anti-West sentiment as propaganda tool. And this is one of the reasons they separated all the nations living in Soviet Union from all the rest of the world. And Russia now also uses these narratives, that Europe and America is anti-Christian, anti-family, Jewish, gay, all these so-called threats, that Russians somehow are fighting back. And
I was simply going to add, and we can see them using it also very, very effectively directly in Africa, right? Not just in the context of support for Ukraine and weaponizing the idea of, anti-colonialism and so on, but also, on the ground, essentially, fomenting. I'm just saying, in the grand tradition of the Soviet Union, Russia is now carrying out this sort of operation on the ground, and we can see it in Niger and we can see it in Burkina Faso, same arguments.
Yeah, and I think another somehow troubling parallel between modern populists, I would say, and Soviet Union is somehow spoken or non-spoken acceptance of antisemitism. Because you know that Soviet Union is rarely looked at through the lens of anti-Semitism, but it was deeply anti-Semitic,
Sure.
both Russian Empire, the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting for me to kind of study why anti-Semitism has been such a persistent element in political programs. You know, and both in the West and under communism, and how does modern populists are using these as well?
Yes, I agree. And what's interesting is that in many of the Western European nations, much less so in Central and Eastern Europe, where, you know, the anti-Semitism remains very alive. In Western Europe, one of the things that's interesting about the populist stances, is that on the right, the threat or the perceived threat by them of Islam is how can I put this? They are so much keener to weaponize the threat of immigration from Muslim countries that, in a sense, somebody like Marine Le Pen, is happy to side, for example, at the moment with Israel, right? Because it allows her to be critical of a number of Arab states and therefore, fuel the anti-Islam discourse that really characterizes them much more now than the anti-Semitic discourse. On the left, on the other hand, right, this is where you find a much more, a discourse that flirts much more with anti-Semitism, than a discourse that flirts with anti-Islam. So, the big accusations, in part against, Jean-Luc Mélenchon here is that he is an anti-Semite. That accusation is leveled much more at him, because of his representations of Israel, than it is leveled at Marine Le Pen, who, in November joined the pro-Israel march, right? So it's very interesting that, in Western Europe, you've got this sense in which, in order to weaponize anti-Muslim attitudes, there is less obvious anti-Semitism, which is a huge, on the right, which is a huge reversal because, Jean-Marie Le Pen in particular, but, most far-right parties in Western Europe have all been marked by anti-Semitism. But right now, they are much keener on being anti-Islam than they are on being anti-Semitic, but that is, very much to do with their immigration stance, and it's not the case, as you know, for populists in Central and Eastern Europe, and most notably Orban, who is still, rabidly anti-Semitic, and same for the Polish Law and Justice.
Yeah, it's actually we've been Ukrainians have been fighting against this image,
Yes.
that's been created, that kind of Ukraine is inherently anti-Semitic, and they use this term to describe modern Ukraine, which is just untrue. And this is very interesting how Russia also being anti-Semitic itself, which we see with the pogroms and with their basically state policies, that they're not perceived as one. And while Ukraine often perceived as anti-Semitic, so in the minds of voters, for example, for far right in France, they would see that we support Israel, but we also don't support Ukraine because they're anti-Semitic, and this is just a bizarre mix of narrative.
It's a huge reversal of narrative, right? You have a party that has always been anti-Semitic, certainly the Front National, who is now claiming to side with Israel and Jewish communities. We know that they're doing this because they are actually very much anti-Muslim and For the wrong reasons. And therefore, they're refusing to participate in the defense of Ukraine because they're accusing Ukraine of being anti-Semitic. It is really surreal.
And I wanted to switch kind of to the topic which happened just a few days ago, which you've probably seen, about the Venice Film Festival. And the question here is, many cultural institutions in the West, which we can argue they lean left mostly, and Ukraine has struggled with it a lot to kind of decolonize this perception of Ukraine and to find a place for our voice within these institutions. And with the Venice Film Festival, they showed this movie, Russians at War, which was made by the woman who has been working with Kremlin propaganda channel Russia Today. And the movie itself is complete propaganda. Mm-hmm. And before that, she also depicted war in Syria without acknowledging that Russia is actually an aggressor. And what do you think? Why is this kind of situation still accepted? It feels like here also it's not a logical decision making. It's like with populism, some kind of emotional appeals, and where Russians are given space to speak and to be present, despite the risks that Russia actually poses to the security of the region, of the country. Why do you think this kind of decision making still exists within the cultural and maybe political institutions as well?
I mean, this is a really good question, and to be honest, I was unaware of this having happened at the Venice Film Festival. So I have to admit to being out of the loop here. There's a couple of things that go through my mind. One is that this it could be, and I'm not saying it is, but it could be an Italian thing. As you know, Italy is a place that has a particular relationship with Russia. As you know, it is amongst those countries where support for Ukraine is weakest. And where, it's a strange kind of so-called pacifism that you alluded to earlier on in the conversation, where, we don't want war, therefore let's make peace, as if somehow, you could just ignore the fact that a country has just been attacked, right? So I think that, depending on whether this is true of other places, which I don't know, I would have thought that in most places, the Russian point of view was less welcome now, and Russia propaganda was less welcome now. But I think Italy is really rather particular. The other thing to factor into place is that Venetian politics are really rather particular, because they are in the hands of the region is in the hands of the League, formerly the Northern League, and that's Salvini, that's the right-wing populist party, and he is very clearly pro-Putin, right? So I don't know whether the combination of all these things explains in part this very strange choice. I also don't know, was the Ukrainian, I mean, I'm not saying that, we should be giving equal billing to Ukraine and Russia. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. But was there Ukrainian representation? Were there, voices?
It was, I think it's important to mention that the film is actually produced by French-Canadian companies. Yeah. And the money was given also by, I think, Canadian fund. Wow. And the funny thing that this director, she produced, I think, 11 documentaries with Russia Today, which is sanctioned and banned in these countries. That's why it's very, odd to see this. I didn't think about it from the Italian perspective as well. But there was a Ukrainian movie presented at the same category, which was like outside of category, something like these documentaries. And the thing is that this movie, Russians at War, they basically justifying what Russian soldiers are doing, because the director claims that there was no war crimes committed, that they're just nice little men, and things like this, which happened during the Nazi regime as well. Yeah, so this is not something new. But I believe that Venice Film Festival is just because it's very recent, but me, I also work, for example, with International Committee for Museums in Ukraine. And there is another example that International Committee for Literary and Composer Museums, they decided to relocate their annual conference from Norway to Spain because Norway banned Russian citizens with non-essential visas. And they made this decision basically just for Russians to attend. And it needs to be understood that one of these Russians is, for example, Yuri Komlev, who is a museologist that organized exhibitions in occupied Ukraine, who made Ukrainian children write letters to Russian soldiers. And all of this is a violation of international law. But this institution is ready to make so much effort to cancel the event in Norway and to move it to Spain just to prioritize participation of Russians. And we see these issues happening from time to time.
Yeah.
It's quite common to see. Yeah. But again, this is a question of how it's still how do they explain it to the public, because here I might be speculating, but I believe that these issues are considered from the perspective of freedom of speech or even, some human rights, but not actually from the perspective of security. Because this is when you let possible war criminal to come to your country to represent his museum, this is a security issue, not the issue of whether he's allowed to speak or not. So I think this is like kind of a mix, mixed idea of what is.
No, I think I completely agree with you. And there's a couple of things at play here. I think that there is still in some cultural institutions very much a misplaced sense of neutrality. Don't punish the artists. Just in other words, either remain neutral, or even if you're not neutral, then you shouldn't be targeting individuals. You should be looking at regimes. I think that unfortunately is still very much at play in a number of cultural institutions where the kind of stances that are critical of the West, critical of the United States, and a lot of cultural institutions are super critical of the United States, which they see as not being able to nurture culture from a state perspective, but only from a capitalist perspective, and therefore, they're accused of consumerism and so on and so forth. Well, which is not false, etc. But it does mean that I think too many of these cultural institutions do have, I think, a reaction of trying to not pick sides. I also think, and I've noted this in a number of communications from Ukraine, that the Western Europe and the United States, the sort of the allied countries here, are still at the very beginning of a very steep learning curve in terms of understanding Ukraine as a nation, as a sovereign power, as something that is distinct from the Soviet Union. And I'm sure, you don't want to hear this, but I think that we've all been, some more than others, but I think it's been very slow, in the West to really acknowledge the colonial work that had been done from Russia, by Russia to Ukraine, and to perceive it as culturally independent and separate. And I think that this is one of the things that is still at play. And presumably, this is why, you're interested in the decolonization argument. But I still think that there's a very long way to go for Western public opinion to understand, what the game that is still being played, sometimes even subconsciously, by so many of these institutions that do not grant Ukraine the cultural and political status that it has achieved and that it has.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I believe that this is this gap somehow in understanding. I think it goes not just to Ukraine but to Eastern Central Europe in general.
Definitely.
And of course, Ukraine now in the news, and we are going through, I would say, through decolonization now, but with blood. Yeah, we're fighting the war, and it's kind of our biggest step in losing this imperial, hands of Russia. But if you look into Eastern and Central Europe, for example, it's Europe. Yeah, so this is a part of the structure that always been there, but somehow it's kind of this blind spot for Western Europeans. Like even if you take many countries that used to be in so-called Warsaw Pact, they're now part of the EU and NATO. Yet there's still some kind of bias towards Eastern Europeans.
Yes,
and I think it's in many ways a part of intellectual and educational frameworks rather than just news or, general information, like general knowledge. But when it comes to the question, what do you believe needs to change for these perceptions to kind of move forward, and and whether better understanding of Ukraine and Eastern Europe in general can help European Union or like Western Europe to strengthen its own democracy?
I mean, I think a better understanding of Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe is absolutely crucial, because I mean, I've had the good fortune of traveling to, most Central and Eastern European countries. I've never been to Ukraine, but, I've been to most of Central and Eastern Europe. And, it was important that I do that and that I experience and that I read, because, I mean, as somebody, I'm in my mid-50s, I grew up going from thinking that Central and Eastern Europe was an excrescence of the Soviet Union to transitioning in the early 90s to thinking that Central and Eastern Europe was an excrescence of the EU, right? So a lot of people, I think, are in my situation, where the specificity of what makes for the CEE, right, as we refer to these countries, the specificities of each of these places it's still absolutely unknown, right? It went from being part of one empire in people's political, recent political imagination, to being a part of, the European Union, which, isn't even, properly imagined, to some extent, right? It's a kind of a process of, of enlargement, right? As if it was a kind of syncretic thing where, we just absorb these cultures that we don't really understand or know. So I think there's, such a fundamental ignorance about, about the history of pre-Soviet history, pre-Soviet culture, the distinctions between each of these places. I think it's colossally important. And not only that, but, we knew this, before Putin turned into a full-fledged dictator. We knew this early on, that we didn't know enough, right? That in a sense, it's as if the curtain had never properly been lifted, right? We just kind of thought we didn't need to know very, very much more. And yet the unease around the idea of enlargement, different forms of unease, here in France, this idea that enlargement was something that was really pushed by the United States in order to keep Europe sort of very, very broad and very thin to avoid, the emergence of a proper political project. This is often how the French have thought about it. The French elite have thought about it. In the UK, there was, anxiety about, people coming over from various parts of Central and Eastern Europe and most notably, Poland, in terms of an economic worry and jobs and so on. But the fact is that, most of us who were, political analysts were aware of the fact that we weren't properly doing our homework, right? We were taking an awful lot for granted that, essentially being a part of the EU, it would erase in some ways distinctions, divergences and disagreements. But in fact, these things haven't been erased, and it's partly because we don't understand the depth of, we don't understand the diversities of cultures and political trajectories that we're faced with. So it's fundamental that we know more. Fundamental.
You say that we've been discussing in other series of interviews with Ukrainer, for example, Volodymyr Yermolenko. It's Ukrainian philosopher, yeah. And he's the president of PEN Ukraine. And he said this phrase that we're moving as Ukrainians towards the West, believing that the West is stronger. And in many ways it still is. But somehow Europe also needs us because Ukrainians are bringing this strong idea of liberty and brings kind of new energy to democracy and to actually reminds the West the value of democracy because we're fighting for it and because this is the system and the only way that we see for ourselves. And do you feel like this Ukrainian perseverance and resilience motivates Europeans to think about their own countries a little bit more?
Oh, I think it has prompted people to think about their own countries a lot more, not necessarily in the constructive ways that one might have wished for, but there has been a re-examination, in a lot of circles across European societies in different ways. Obviously, they each have obviously their political cultures and trajectories, but, there's been a re-examination of what we should cherish, of what people are willing to defend, and of what people might be willing to die for, right? I mean, this put it very, very clearly at the heart of discussions. And, I know that here in France, for example, I think it was at the end of March, Macron said something about, well, if we had to, the president said, if we had to, we would put boots on the ground, right? I mean, that came as a huge shock to the French public and triggered a conversation. Some of it was nonsense, but some of it was, salutary. People actually, ask themselves, okay, since the end of the Second World War, they haven't asked themselves, well, what would we be willing to die for, right? What would we be willing to defend to the bitter end? And I think that, what we know about the courage of Ukrainian civil society and not to mention Ukrainian soldiers, it has jolted a part of the population into thinking about this. It has also triggered, though, a kind of ostrich politics in parts of every country, where, pacifist reactions about, anything but war, the kind of the desire to negotiate in order to avoid any kind of violence. But it has brought the conversation back. I think aside from the way in which people have thought about Ukraine, and they have thought about Ukraine, I think with great admiration. There's also been a very fundamental rethink about about what is European power or lack of, right? Or lack of European power. So, the discussions about producing more weapons, about spending more on defense, the realization of, where the relevant borders are, of the role of Poland, of the role of Germany, in protecting the rest of Europe and, acting, and the role of Ukraine as, as acting as a defense, as a buffer, between Europe and Vladimir Putin. And of course, we need to stop thinking obviously of Ukraine as just a buffer zone, right? But the fact that de facto, that is what it has been, for over 2 years. That has prompted Europeans to rethink their own priorities in terms of defense, with respect to not just Putin, but, other potential threats. And so, it has been salutary. I hope that we can continue to draw the lessons from this. I sometimes lose hope, because, Germany and France are not pulling their weight right now in terms of what they could be doing, in the EU, for different reasons. But, but let's hope that some lessons are being drawn. Yes.
Yeah, we hope so too. And it felt like when Macron, every time he was saying some kind of was taking stronger position, it in many ways were uniting people. I heard when I was in the UK, many people told me that, Ukraine united us.
Yeah.
Whatever political spectrum you're on, Ukraine was the issue that actually united the population, because the level of support in the UK is very high, and it's something that people can actually agree on, because they still want to agree on the basic idea of liberty and democracy, and that's something that is something important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to kind of summarize, I wanted to ask you, in Ukraine, when we talk about the colonial studies, the colonization process in general, we speak a lot, of course, about culture, about education, how Ukraine needs to be present more in different institutions, how our voices need to be heard, how we need to fight against this perception that everything behind the Berlin Wall is Russia. But I think there is this idea that Ukraine needs to become a subject, not just an object of discussion. That this is kind of a goal that we want to achieve with this, when Ukraine is perceived as something unique and separate from anything else. And from your line of work, in political studies, in academia, what do you believe should Ukraine work on? Maybe something that needs to change for these industries to be kind of decolonized of Russian influence?
I think that there's that old expression, which I don't particularly like, but I think it's important in this case, which is that since, particularly not just the annexation of Crimea, but, since certainly the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Ukraine has been, in a sense, on the menu. And Zelensky has done everything he could to be a party to dialogue and negotiation. But for obvious and very understandable reasons, he has one job and one job only, and that is to secure more support, more, and more weapons. But I think it's really important that Ukraine not just be on the menu, but Ukraine all of Ukraine be around the table, right? So around the table in a number of cultural institutions. I think that, around the issues, around the instances of the European political community is another place, around educational organizations. And of course, I realize that I say this about a country that is, at war, and therefore, there are great limitations to what it can invest in and what it can do. But I think that, the task of those of us who are outside of Ukraine is to make sure that, Ukrainian political culture, Ukrainian voices are actually represented, outside of those institutions that are directly involved in the conflict, in order, for Ukraine to exist, as a partner in education, in culture, in innovation, in technology, et cetera, so that it becomes a subject in a dialogue rather than a topic for discussion.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for this talk, and I hope we're gonna talk again.
Definitely.
On many other subjects.
Definitely, and face to face.
Yes. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support us at buymeacoffee.com/Ukrainier International and follow us on social media in different languages. You can find all the links in the podcast description. And thank you for listening.